Cathy stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, smoothing the collar of her navy blue blouse. It was a quiet kind of elegant, just enough to look put together, but not enough to draw attention. At 66, she had perfected the art of looking appropriate, presentable, pleasant. In the reflection, she saw David adjusting his tie. He caught her eye and smiled briefly. "You look nice," he said, already moving toward the closet to grab his jacket. "We don't want to be late. You know how Charles is about punctuality." Cathy nodded, slipping on her shoes. It was the same group: Charles, Linda, Gary, Sylvia, and the rest of David's longtime friends. They'd all known each other since their 20s. Cathy had married into the group in her early 40s after David's first marriage ended quietly and with little discussion. She had never quite felt part of it, more like an accessory to the gatherings. The one who brought the dessert, remembered the birthdays, and asked about everyone's grandkids. Never the one anyone asked about. Still, she smiled. She always smiled. As they pulled into Charles and Linda's driveway, David reached over and gave her knee a light squeeze. "Thanks for coming with me. I know these dinners aren't your favorite." That was his version of, "I know you'll be invisible for the next 3 hours, but your presence still looks good for me." They stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of Linda's pot roast and a chorus of overlapping greetings. The women kissed cheeks and complimented scarves. The men clapped shoulders and made jokes about cholesterol and retirement golf scores. The dining room was set for 10, as usual. Cathy found her seat next to David and quietly unfolded her napkin. The meal went as expected. Charles dominated the conversation with a story about his latest cruise. Gary chimed in with complaints about the stock market. David told a long-winded tale about a business deal he'd made years ago. Every time Cathy opened her mouth to comment, someone else spoke louder. She tried twice, once to respond to a question about grandchildren, once to ask about Linda's knee surgery, but both times she was talked over, or worse, not even acknowledged. She smiled anyway. She passed the bread. She kept the wine glasses full. After dessert, she excused herself to get their coats from the hallway closet. As she turned the corner toward the front of the house, she heard laughter drifting from the living room. It was the men: David, Charles, and Gary. Their voices low but jovial, tinged with wine and old boy ease. "She still comes to everything, huh?" Charles said. "Who?" Gary asked. "David's wife, Cathy." There was a pause, then a chuckle, then David's voice light, amused. "Yeah, I bring her, but honestly, no one remembers she's even there." More laughter, the kind that came easy when you didn't think anyone was listening. Cathy froze. Her hand, which had been reaching for David's coat, curled slowly into a fist. Her heart thudded, not in rage, but in something colder, sharper. Recognition. It wasn't just what they said, it was how casually they said it, as if she were a piece of furniture. A lamp someone admired once but no longer noticed. "No one remembers she's even there." The words wrapped around her like fog. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer, swallowing the sting. Then she turned, walked back to the dining room, and waited, composed. David emerged a few minutes later, smiling like nothing had happened. He took the coats from her, kissed her cheek distractedly, and said his goodbyes. "Lovely night," he said as they drove home. "You were quiet, as always, my peaceful Cathy." She said nothing. Not because she agreed, but because something inside her was no longer interested in playing that part. When they got home, David went straight to the bedroom to change and turn on the television. Cathy stayed behind in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. She opened the drawer where she kept her old notebooks, the ones from her teaching days, the ones she hadn't touched in over a decade. She pulled one out. The pages smelled faintly of ink and dust and regret. She sat down at the kitchen table, pen poised above the paper, and wrote, "Tonight I disappeared in a room full of people who have known me for 25 years, and none of them noticed. Not even the man who drove me home. She underlined the last sentence. Twice. Then she sat very still. She didn't cry, she didn't rage. She just knew. Something had shifted. Not out of drama, not out of pride, but because the silence had finally echoed too loudly to ignore. And Cathy was done being remembered as someone who was barely there. The morning after the dinner party, Cathy woke up before sunrise, not because of habit, but because her thoughts hadn't let her sleep. She had turned the conversation over in her mind all night, word by word. Laughter by laughter. No one remembers she's even there. That line kept floating to the surface like a bruise under the skin. David was snoring softly beside her, oblivious. When Cathy slipped out of bed, she didn't bother tucking in the sheets like she usually did. She walked barefoot into the kitchen, brewed a pot of tea, and stood by the window holding the cup in both hands. The sky was still that pre-dawn gray, the kind of color that reminded her of her own life, muted, gentle, invisible if you weren't looking directly at it. She glanced at the notebook on the table, the one she'd written in the night before. One line, a truth so plain it looked like fiction. I disappeared in a room full of people who have known me for 25 years, and none of them noticed. She opened a fresh page and wrote again. It's not the forgetting that hurts, it's that I spent so long trying to be remembered the right way. Gracious, supportive, quiet. All that quiet made me forget how to speak for myself. The pen felt foreign in her hand, but the words flowed like a current she didn't know she still carried. Later that morning, David emerged from the bedroom in gym shorts and a wrinkled t-shirt. He kissed her cheek, grabbed a banana, and started scrolling through his phone. You okay? He asked between bites. You're quiet this morning. Cathy smiled just a little. I've been quiet for 30 years, David. You're just noticing? He chuckled, oblivious, assuming it was a joke. Hey, we're having dinner with Charles and Linda again next Friday. Linda says she's trying a new roast recipe. Cathy didn't answer. She was already somewhere else in her mind. That afternoon, while David was out, Cathy climbed into the attic. She hadn't been up there in years. Dust clung to every box like regret. She dug through holiday decorations, old sweaters, and finally found what she was looking for, a black plastic crate labeled, Cathy, Teaching Stuff. Inside, lesson plans, old essays, and her writing. Fiction, essays, journal entries, short stories she had written back when she was still Cathy Green, the literature teacher who inspired girls to find their voices. Before she became David's wife. At the very bottom, she found an old manila folder. The front was labeled in blue ink, personal, not for class. She opened it. Inside were printouts of stories she'd submitted to journals in her 40s, some with rejection letters, some with encouraging notes from editors. Her fingers traced the faded margins where someone had written, quietly powerful, a voice we hope to hear more from. She laughed bitterly. No one's heard from her in a long time, she whispered. But maybe it wasn't too late. That night, when David fell asleep in front of the TV, Cathy sat on the back porch with a blanket and her laptop. The stars were out, and for once, they didn't feel so far away. She opened a new document, titled it, The Woman at the Edge of the Room, a memoir. And she wrote, There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being praised for how little you need. For being agreeable, for never interrupting. For disappearing so gracefully that no one even realizes you're gone. She wrote for hours. Her fingers ached, but her chest felt lighter with every paragraph. The next day, she emailed someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Liz McAllister, a former colleague and dear friend, now working as a freelance editor and publishing consultant. Her message was short. Liz, I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. I remember your red pens and your honest advice. I found something I wrote. Actually, I'm writing again, and I think it might be something. Can I send it to you?" She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. Then she went to the guest room and pulled down a suitcase from the closet shelf. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay here not as this version of herself. David noticed the suitcase by the door that evening. "Are you going somewhere?" Cathy didn't look up from her tea. "I might." He raised an eyebrow. "For how long?" "I don't know yet." "Is something wrong?" Now she looked at him. "You didn't hear them, David. At Charles' house. You didn't hear what they said." He blinked. "Who? What are you talking about?" "They were laughing. About how no one remembers me at these dinners, that I'm just there, like a houseplant." David shook his head, frowning. "They were joking. You know how those guys are. Don't take it so personally." Cathy smiled again, but this time it wasn't gentle. "I am taking it personally, David. Because it is personal." She paused. "I'm not angry. I'm just done pretending I don't notice." She stood, walked past him, and picked up her suitcase. And in that moment, quiet, calm, without yelling or drama, Cathy took herself seriously for the first time in decades. And that, she knew, was the beginning of a very different story. Cathy hadn't booked a hotel, not yet. She needed somewhere to land, somewhere that didn't carry the smell of her marriage, the weight of unspoken things in every room. So she drove. No GPS, no destination, just highway. By late afternoon, she found herself at the coast, where the air smelled of salt, and the light came in slow through the fog. There was a small inn perched on a hill overlooking the sea, nothing fancy. White siding, green shutters, a wraparound porch. It felt anonymous. And for now, that was exactly what she needed. A place where no one knew her as David's wife. A place where she could breathe without being reflected in someone else's expectations. She checked in under her maiden name, Catherine Green. She hadn't used it in years. The sound of it made her pulse skip, like stepping back into a pair of shoes she'd forgotten she ever loved. The room was simple, a twin bed, a little writing desk, a window that looked out toward the waves. She sat down, opened her laptop, and began to write. The words didn't come in tidy lines. They poured out like water from a faucet long rusted shut. Chapter after chapter of quiet moments she'd tucked into the corners of her memory. The nights she'd stood beside David at business functions, smiling until her cheeks hurt while he introduced her as his better half, only to leave her alone while he networked for hours. The mornings she cooked breakfast, poured coffee, kissed his cheek, and he never once asked how she slept. The years she gave up writing because there was always something more important to do. And the worst part, she let it happen. Not because she was weak, but because she'd been trained to believe that being less demanding was the same as being loving. She was beginning to unlearn that. Line by line. 3 days into her stay at the inn, her inbox pinged. It was Liz. "Cathy, I remember you vividly. You were the woman who encouraged your students to read Toni Morrison and Virginia Woolf before it was cool. Of course I remember you. And yes, I would love to read what you're working on. Send it." Cathy stared at the screen for a long time. Then she attached the first 30 pages of her manuscript, hit send, closed the laptop, and immediately regretted it. But it was done. She went for a walk on the beach, let the wind tangle her hair, let the silence of the waves answer the anxiety in her chest. She didn't check her email that night, or the next morning. But on the evening of the 4th day, Liz responded. "Cathy, I read every word. Then I read them again. You're writing what so many women feel but don't know how to say. You're not just telling your story. You're giving them a voice, too. I showed it just a few chapters to a colleague who works with a mid-sized press." She cried. "They want more. Would you be open to submitting the full manuscript?" Cathy's hands shook. Not from fear. From recognition. For the first time in decades, someone had seen Heron, not just seen her, but heard her, valued what she had to say. She responded with a single line. Yes, I'm ready. Then she set her alarm for 6 the next morning. There was still so much to write. That night, she dreamed of a classroom filled with women in their 50s, 60s, 70s each holding a pen, each writing their names across blank pages like signatures of defiance. When she woke, she sat at the little desk by the window and started a new chapter. We don't vanish all at once. We fade slowly, with every time someone interrupts us, and we smile instead of finishing the sentence. With every time we enter a room and no one rises to greet us. With every year we trade dreams for dinner reservations. Until one day we realize we were never erased. We were just shelved. She didn't stop writing until the sun came up. And somewhere between paragraphs, Cathy realized she wasn't just writing a memoir anymore. She was writing her way back to herself. Cathy sat at the kitchen table of her rental cottage, holding a printed copy of her manuscript. Her hand trembled slightly as she ran her fingers along the title page. The Woman at the Edge of the Room, by Catherine Green. Not Cathy, not Mrs. David Armstrong. Catherine Green. Her name. Her words. Her truth. The final chapter had been written just hours before. It wasn't dramatic, not filled with revenge or explosions of rage. It was quiet, strong. It ended with a woman walking into a bookstore alone and buying a pen, her first in years, with the intent to write her own name again. Cathy didn't cry when she printed it. She felt full. Not of regret. Of herself. The next morning, Liz called. Her voice was buzzing with something barely contained. They want to publish it, Cathy, she said, almost breathless. The full manuscript, national release, fall catalog. They're offering a standard advance, and if we play it right, this could grow. Cathy didn't respond right away. Not because she was unsure, but because, for a moment, she needed to sit with what that meant. This story, her story, was about to leave her hands. It was about to go out into a world where other women, quiet like her, would read it and maybe, just maybe, feel a little less alone. A little more visible. I accept, she finally said, voice calm. Let's do it. 2 weeks later, Cathy returned home. Not because she missed it. Because she needed to face it. David was in the garden, watering the tomatoes. He looked up as she pulled into the driveway, surprise flickering across his face like the last blink of a porch light. You're back, he said, walking toward her. I am, she said, stepping out of the car. But I'm not staying. He froze, still holding the watering can. You're leaving again? I never really left, she replied softly. I just stepped out of the background. They stood in silence, the breeze brushing past them like a witness. David gestured toward the house. Do you want to come inside? No, we can talk here. She watched him take a seat on the porch step. She didn't sit. I wrote a book, she said. He blinked. A book? Yes, about my life, about our life, about being the woman at the edge of every room for 20 years. David looked down at his shoes. Is it about me? It's about me, she said. You just happen to be in it. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I thought we were okay, Cathy. You thought I was content, she corrected. Because I didn't complain, because I didn't demand anything, because I smiled through every dinner where I was talked over or ignored. You thought that was happiness. It wasn't. He looked up at her. His eyes, once so sure of the role she played in his life, were searching. I didn't mean to make you feel invisible. You didn't make me, Cathy said gently. I agreed to it, I allowed it, but I don't anymore. She stepped closer. I'm not here to punish you, David. I'm not here to fix anything. I just came to tell you the truth and to gather the last of my things. His voice cracked. Is this goodbye? Cathy paused. It's the end of something, yes, but it's also the beginning of me. That night, back at the cottage, Cathy opened her email to find a message from the publishing house's marketing team. We've been reviewing your manuscript. We think The Woman at the Edge of the Room is powerful but perhaps too subtle. Would you consider a new title? Something stronger? Something that hits immediately? Cathy smiled. Her fingers danced across the keyboard. New title, The Invisible Wife. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't soft. It was exactly what it needed to be. The next morning, she received another email, this time from a podcast producer who'd read an early draft. We'd love to have you on our show, the message read. We're doing a series called Women Who Reappeared. Your story fits perfectly. Cathy leaned back in her chair. Reappeared? What a beautiful word. She wasn't a comeback story, she was a rediscovery. A woman who had been here all along, waiting for her own permission to be seen. Before going to bed that night, she wrote a new journal entry. I no longer need to shout to be heard. I only need to speak in my own voice. If it's not loud enough for others, that's not my problem anymore. She closed the book, turned out the light, and fell asleep. Not with regret. Not with revenge. But with the kind of peace that comes from finally walking into the center of your own life. Cathy stood at the back of the independent bookstore, clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. It was her first public reading. 20 folding chairs filled the small space between the shelves, now fully occupied. Most of the audience were women over 50, gray roots unapologetically peeking through salon color, crow's feet resting gently in the corners of eyes that had seen things. She didn't wear anything flashy, just her favorite forest green cardigan and the small silver ring her mother once wore. But tonight she felt dressed in truth. When the manager introduced her, please welcome Catherine Green, author of The Invisible Wife. Cathy took a breath, stepped forward, and smiled. And the room fell silent. She read from chapter 6. We've been taught to take up less space, to end our sentences with question marks, to say I'm fine when we're unraveling. For years, I mistook being agreeable for being loved. But I wasn't loved, I was convenient. And then I left, not to punish anyone. I left because I finally remembered that I too had a name. When she looked up, there were tears in the front row. Not loud, not messy, just glistening acknowledgement. Afterward, they lined up with books. Some wanted signatures. Others wanted to touch her hand. Most just wanted to say, "Thank you. I thought I was the only one." In the weeks that followed, everything accelerated. A viral TikTok featured a young woman reading a passage from the book to her mother. The mother burst into tears on camera. The comment section exploded. This book healed something in me I didn't know was broken. My mom is the invisible wife. I'm 63. I just bought my first journal. Within days, The Invisible Wife climbed to the top 10 in its category on Amazon, then 2, then 1. But Cathy didn't care about the rankings. She cared about the emails. They came in dozens at first, then hundreds, then thousands. Your words gave me back my voice. My husband never hit me, he just forgot me. That was enough. I left at 70, I'm scared, but I'm also awake for the first time in decades. Cathy read every message. Every single one. And with each one, she felt something open wider inside her. She hadn't just written a book. She had opened a door. 2 months after publication, Cathy was invited to appear on a national morning show. She sat in the green room beside her publicist, holding a small printed photo of her 30-year-old self, which she tucked inside her coat pocket. That girl young Cathy had been ambitious, romantic, careful. She hadn't known how much of herself she'd end up folding away for the comfort of others. Ready? The producer asked. Cathy nodded. On camera, she spoke slowly, clearly not like someone trying to prove herself, but like someone who had already survived. When the host asked what inspired the book, Cathy said, "I overheard my husband's friend say no one ever remembered me in a room. That I was just there. And the truth was, he was right. I was there, quiet, accommodating. So much so, I disappeared." The book wasn't revenge. It was a search party. The interview went viral before the credits even rolled. That evening, Cathy received a message from David. "Cathy, I bought the book. I read it in one sitting. I don't know how I missed all of it. I thought you were just content. I didn't realize contentment could be a kind of prison." She stared at the message for a long time before replying. "You didn't look for me, David. And eventually, I stopped expecting to be found. Now I'm not waiting anymore. Now I'm building something." He sent one final message. "I see that now. And I see you. I just wish I had seen you before everyone else did." Cathy didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because that regret, quiet and private, was no longer hers to carry. The next week, she signed a deal to publish a follow-up anthology. Invisible No More, the stories we're finally telling. It would feature women across the country sharing their own awakenings, some loud, some small, all transformative. And Cathy knew then, this was her second act. Not one of survival, but of sovereignty. She was no longer waiting to be introduced. She was taking the stage. The hall was already half full when Cathy arrived, a black leather-bound notebook pressed gently to her chest. It was her first official workshop. Write Yourself Visible, a title chosen not by a marketing team, but by Cathy herself, scribbled on a napkin over tea one quiet morning. The event had sold out in under 48 hours. 72 women of all shapes, shades, and life stories gathered in a community center usually reserved for local book clubs and knitting circles. But today, it buzzed with something deeper, long silenced stories waiting for oxygen. There were women in blazers and pearls, others in jeans and cardigans. Some came alone, some brought daughters. One came in a wheelchair, holding her granddaughter's hand. None of them looked invisible. But Cathy knew better. She stepped to the front of the room, took a breath, and smiled. "Raise your hand," she began, "if you've ever spoken, and someone talked over you." Nearly every hand lifted. "Raise your hand if you've stayed silent, not because you had nothing to say, but because you knew no one would really listen." Every hand again. She nodded, slowly. "Then welcome. You're not too late. You're not too old. You are not a footnote in someone else's story. You are the author now." In the weeks that followed, the workshops grew. First to nearby towns, then cross-country. Cathy spoke at libraries, women's shelters, even prisons. Wherever she went, women handed her pieces of their lives, folded letters, old diaries, typed-out poems they'd never shown anyone. She listened, she held space, and she told them, "This matters. You matter." Meanwhile, her second book, Invisible No More, the stories we're finally telling, went to print. It wasn't just her voice this time, it was dozens, hundreds. Women who had once whispered their pain in bathroom mirrors, now brave enough to share it out loud. And Cathy? She was no longer on the edge of the room. She was the room. One crisp autumn afternoon, she returned to her hometown for a reading event. As she entered the venue, she noticed a man standing quietly in the back corner, holding a copy of her first book. David. Their eyes met. He didn't wave. He didn't ask to speak. He simply nodded, acknowledging her, not as his wife, but as someone he finally understood he had never truly seen. Cathy returned the nod. There was nothing to fix, no apologies to accept. Only recognition. And peace. During the queue, a portion of the event, a woman stood up. She looked to be in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had known quiet battles. I just wanted to ask, she began, voice shaking slightly, what was the moment that made you walk away? Cathy paused. The crowd leaned in, breath held. Then she said softly, "It wasn't a fight. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't even pain, not exactly." She looked down at her hands, then back at the woman. "It was the moment I realized I could be in a room full of people I've known for decades, and not one of them remembered I was there. Not one of them would notice if I stood up and left." She let the silence sit for a moment. "So I did." That night, Cathy sat alone on the balcony of her cottage, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Below, the sea moved in slow, steady rhythm like breath. She opened her journal. "I am not an echo. I am not wallpaper. I am not the pause between someone else's sentences. I am a story unfolding, unfinished, and entirely mine." The wind carried the sound of waves and distant gulls. Her cat curled beside her chair. She sipped her tea, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I'm not invisible anymore." She smiled. Not because she needed the world to see her now, but because she finally saw herself. Fully, clearly, and she would never look away again.